She's just a worthless daughter. My mother's voice sliced through the courtroom like a knife through glass. For a moment, the room froze. That kind of hush that makes strangers feel awkward for a family they don't even know. I didn't speak. I stood at the defense table in the old Mason County Courthouse in Ohio, hands folded, eyes straight ahead. The judge lifted his gaze slowly from the papers on his desk. My father shifted uncomfortably beside my mother, arms crossed, jaw tight like he was chewing on rocks. Whispers floated from the crowd. One woman murmured, "Lord have mercy." I stayed silent. Then the judge leaned back, peered over his glasses at my parents' lawyer, and asked the question that would change everything. "Counselor," he said slowly, "do you really not know who she is?" The attorney froze. My parents' faces drained of color, but that moment didn't appear from nowhere. It had begun months earlier when I returned to the town I'd promised I'd never set foot in again. I hadn't been back to Mason County in nearly 8 years. Small towns remember everything about you while pretending nothing has changed. The brick courthouse still stood at Main and Jefferson. The diner across the street still had its neon sign buzzing faintly. Same people, same booths, same morning chatter about weather, politics, and whose grandson got hired at the hardware store. The only difference was me. I parked my old pickup outside the diner one Monday morning and just sat, engine off, taking it all in. Early October, air heavy with fallen leaves and wood smoke. A couple of retirees sipped coffee inside. I recognized one immediately, Mr. Donnelly, who ran the feed store when I was a kid. He had to be close to 80. He glanced out, squinted, then eyebrows lifted. He remembered me. Small towns don't forget faces. I stepped out and walked in. The bell above the door jingled softly. Every head turned. It felt like stepping into a photograph. The waitress behind the counter, Marlene, blinked twice. "Emily Carter?" she asked. "Morning, Marlene," I said, smiling politely. "Well, I'll be," she whispered. "Didn't think we'd see you around here again." Neither did I. I slid onto a stool at the counter. Coffee arrived without asking. Small towns remember what you drink. Black. Marlene poured slowly, studying my face as if comparing it to some long-stored memory. "You here visiting your, folks?" she asked carefully. "Something like that," I said. Truth was more complicated. I hadn't spoken to my parents in nearly 5 years. Our last conversation ended with my father telling me I was wasting my life, my mother agreeing. I'd packed my bag, left before sunrise. No goodbye, no forwarding address. Just silence. That silence felt peaceful, until the call came. 3. Weeks before I returned to Mason County, a number I didn't recognize rang my phone. I was in my Columbus apartment, sorting VA paperwork. "Emily, it's Pastor Caldwell," a soft voice said. I hadn't heard that name in years. He had been the pastor at our church when I was growing up. "How have you been, Pastor?" I asked. A pause, then a sigh. "I'm afraid I'm calling with sad news, Emily. Your grandmother passed last night." The words hung heavy. Grandma Ruth had been the only one who never made me feel like a disappointment. She used to say, "You don't have to stay where you're not wanted, sweetheart." "I'm sorry to hear that," I whispered. "There's something else," the pastor continued. My grandmother had left a will. According to it, she left her house and a small piece of land outside town to me. I stared at the wall long after the call ended. Grandma's farmhouse, the apple tree in the yard, the one place in Mason County I ever felt safe. I didn't want the land. But one thing was clear. If my parents discovered the will, there would be trouble. 2 days after arriving, the trouble arrived. I was sitting on the porch, watching the wind dance through the fields, when a car creaked into the gravel driveway. My father's old Buick. He stepped out first, my mother following. Neither waved. They climbed the porch like approaching strangers. "You came back for the money," my father said. I kept calm. "It's not about money." "You disappear for years, and the moment there's property, you show up," my mother spat bitterly. I stood. "I came because Grandma asked for me." "That's funny," my father said, "because we were the ones taking care of her." The argument lasted under 5 minutes. My father ended it with words I'll never forget. "If you had any decency left, you'd sign that house over. To us." I said nothing, watching them return to their car. 3 days later, a sheriff's deputy knocked with a thick envelope. Court papers. My parents were contesting the will. Just like that, the family I'd avoided dragged me into a courtroom. But silence often carries more truth than shouting ever could, and I had been silent a long time. In small towns, news travels faster than truth. By the time I walked into Donnie's diner the next morning, half the town already knew. They just didn't know the details. And in Mason County, details rarely stop opinions from forming. The bell jingled when I entered. Conversations paused. Marlene was behind the counter, wiping a mug for the 10th time. She tilted her head sympathetically. "Well," she whispered. I slid onto the same stool. "Morning, Marlene," I said. Coffee poured automatically. "You going to fight it?" she asked gently. I wrapped both hands around the warm mug. "I'm going to show up," I said. Honest and simple. Across the diner, Mr. Donnelly pretended to read the paper, but one ear was listening. It reminded me of something my grandmother always said. A small town. Privacy here is more of a polite fiction than reality. I sipped my coffee, eyes fixed. On the courthouse across the street, the same courthouse where my parents had chosen to settle this matter. Not quietly at a kitchen table, not over a phone call, but in front of a judge, under the watchful gaze of strangers. That alone told me how far their anger had grown. The court date was set 3 weeks later. 3 long weeks. Time stretched when you're waiting for something you dread. I spent most of those days fixing small things around my grandmother's house. The screen door needed a new hinge. The porch steps were wobbly. The apple tree in the yard hadn't been pruned in years. Working with my hands kept my mind calm and kept the gossip at bay. Mostly, people still stopped by, rarely to help, mostly to watch. Old Mrs. Talbot from down the road arrived one afternoon with a casserole in her hands and curiosity written all over her face. "I heard your folks are taking you to court," she said, placing the dish in front of me. "That's what the papers say," I replied. She sighed, the way older folks do when preparing to share a long-held opinion. "Families used to settle matters on their own," she said. "Now everyone wants a judge to tell them who's right." She wasn't wrong. I didn't argue. A few days before the hearing, I met the man representing my parents, Harlan Pierce. The kind of attorney you expect to find in a county courthouse. Polished shoes, neat gray hair, confident smile, the aura of someone who has won more cases than he's lost. He caught me outside the courthouse one afternoon. "Miss Carter," he said, offering his hand. I shook it. "Mr. Pierce." He looked me over, not rudely, more like a mechanic inspecting an unfamiliar engine. "I represent your parents," he said, "though I suspect you already know that." "I do," I nodded. "I'm sure you understand their concern. Your grandmother's estate is a significant asset for them at this stage in life." There it was, the argument. I stayed calm. "My grandmother left a will." "Yes," he said. "And wills can be contested when circumstances raise questions." He paused. "If you'd like to avoid unnecessary legal expenses, we could settle this quietly." "What kind of settlement?" I asked. He smiled politely. "Sign the property over to your parents." I almost laughed. Instead, I said what I'd told Marlene. "I'll show up in court." His smile tightened just a fraction. "Well," he said, adjusting his tie, "we'll see what the judge thinks." That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with the will spread out in front of me. Simple. Grandma Ruth had never been complicated. The farmhouse and 2 acres were left to me. But there was a note attached, not legalese, just her handwriting. "Emily, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. Your parents may not understand you the way I do, but I always believed you were stronger than they ever credited you for. Don't let anyone tell you who you are." I folded the note slowly. Grandma had always seen through assumptions. She knew exactly how the town and my parents would judge me. The day before the hearing, my parents arrived at the farmhouse. I spotted their Buick in the driveway early afternoon. I stepped outside before they reached the porch. My father didn't bother with greetings. "Last chance," he said bluntly. People from town had come, not for property law, but for family drama, the oldest entertainment in small towns. My parents sat at the front beside their attorney. My mother avoided my gaze. My father stared straight ahead. I sat at the opposite table, no lawyer. Just a folder of documents and a quiet mind. Mr. Pierce glanced at me. "You're representing yourself?" "Yes." He chuckled politely. "Brave. Maybe foolish, but brave." The bailiff called the room to order. The judge entered. The case of Carter versus Carter officially began. None of us knew it yet, but by the day's end, the courtroom would never see my parents the same way again. Judge Harold Whitaker, lean, silver-haired, in his late 60s, with eyes that had heard every version of human conflict, didn't slam the gavel or make a show. He nodded to the bailiff, adjusted his papers, and said simply, "All right, let's begin." The bailiff announced the case. The courtroom hushed. A fluorescent light buzzed overhead. Someone coughed in the back. Judge Whitaker looked at my parents first. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter, you are contesting the will of the late Ruth Carter. Counsel, you may proceed." Harlan Pierce buttoned his suit jacket and stepped forward, smooth and confident. "Your Honor, this is a painful matter for my clients. They have lived in this community for decades and cared for Mrs. Ruth Carter in her final years. The property in question has long been a family home, an asset that should remain with the parents who maintained family ties and responsibilities." He spoke carefully, trying to sound compassionate and correct. Then he shifted slightly to include the room. "Meanwhile," he said, nodding toward me, "the defendant has been absent for years. She has not contributed to the upkeep of the home. She has not participated in family care. She returned only after Mrs. Carter passed when there was something to gain." My stomach was steady. I had heard sentences like this my whole life. He continued, "We ask the court to recognize undue influence and at the very least the injustice of giving this property to someone who has clearly abandoned her family." Polite words, but each one hit like a slap. Judge Whitaker listened silently, pen moving slowly across his notepad. When Pierce finished, the judge looked at my parents. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "would you like to speak?" My mother stood as if she had been waiting her whole life for this moment, ready to unleash every grievance she had kept inside. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her voice tight. "I do." She faced the judge, but her eyes kept darting to me like I was a stain that wouldn't wash out. "I raised her," my mother said. "I fed her, I clothed her. I did everything a mother should do. And what did I get?" She walked out. She left like we didn't matter. My father nodded, jaw tight. My mother's voice grew louder, not with strength, but desperation. "She didn't call. She didn't come for holidays. She didn't even visit when her grandmother got sick. And now she wants the house, after everything we did." Judge Whitaker raised his hand slightly, not to stop her, just to slow the pace. "I understand you're upset," he said. But my mother wasn't just upset. Her face hardened, the last bit of tenderness replaced by bitterness. Then she said it. "She's just a useless daughter. Not misguided, not confused. Useless." The word hit the room and didn't move, heavy and solid. For a second, no one spoke. I heard a chair creak, a soft gasp, shoes shuffling. Judge Whitaker's gaze shifted from my mother to me. He studied my face as if it were a photograph he didn't fully understand. I kept my eyes forward. I didn't flinch. I didn't shake my head. I didn't defend myself. I stayed silent. Because if I argued, the room would turn into a war of emotions, and my mother had been training for that war for years. Judge Whitaker cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter," he asked my father, "would you like to add anything?" My father rose slowly, each movement deliberate. "She's always been headstrong," he said. "Never wanted to do things the right way. We tried to guide her, but she thought she knew better. Then she left us to handle everything. We're not young anymore, Your Honor." True, they weren't young, but age didn't soften the sharpness of their words. Pierce stepped in smoothly. "Your Honor," he said, "my clients are on a fixed income. Rising taxes, medical bills, property. Costs, they matter. This home is their stability." Judge Whitaker nodded slowly. "I understand those realities," he said. Then he looked at me. "Ms. Carter, you are representing yourself. You may respond." All eyes turned toward me. My palms were dry, my heart steady. Not because I didn't feel anything, but because I had learned to carry feelings without letting them explode. "Yes, Your Honor," I said. I didn't look at my parents. I looked at the judge. "My grandmother wrote her will clearly," I said. "I have a copy here. I also have records of our relationship and proof I stayed in contact when I could. Pierce gave a small, doubtful smile. In contact, he echoed softly, as if mocking. I opened my folder, pulling out letters, printed emails, and records of money orders I sent to my grandmother over the years. Judge Whitaker leaned forward. "Bring those to the clerk," he said. I walked the papers over, handed them in, and returned to my seat. No shouting, no dramatic pleas, just paper, just truth. Judge Whitaker read carefully, his eyes moving over the documents. The courtroom grew heavy with silence. Pierce shifted, uncomfortably. My mother stared at the judge, willing him to decide faster. My father's hands gripped the armrests. The judge paused on one page longer than the rest. His face didn't change much, just a small tightening near his eyes. Then he looked up, first at my folder, then at me. And for the first time that morning, his gaze lingered, as if he had just noticed something important. He set his pen down. "Counselor Pierce," he said calmly. Pierce stepped forward confidently, but I caught a flicker of uncertainty when the judge asked, "Do you really not know who she is?" His face stiffened. My mother's mouth opened slightly. My father blinked hard. Color drained from their faces. "Counselor," the judge repeated slowly, "do you really not know who she is?" Harlan Pierce stood at the front of the courtroom, one hand on the table. Earlier, he had looked confident, guiding an easy case. Now his posture shifted, just slightly, but I saw it. His shoulders tightened, his smile disappeared. He looked at me. Not a glance, but a long look, like someone realizing they'd missed something crucial. "My understanding, Your Honor," Pierce said carefully, "is that she is the defendant in this case." Judge Whitaker didn't smile. "No, that's not what I asked." Silence fell. Behind me, someone whispered. My mother leaned forward, frowning. My father's face hardened. The judge picked up a document from the clerk's stack, tapped it with his pen. "Counselor," he said, "it's generally wise to know who the person you're judging really is." Pierce cleared his throat. "Well, Your Honor, if it's relevant." "There is something relevant," the judge interrupted. He turned the paper so Pierce could see it. I already knew the page, the VA verification letter confirming my service record. Pierce leaned forward. Silence stretched. People in the back shuffled in their seats. Then his eyes widened. "Just a little. But enough," he said slowly. "I was not aware." Judge Whitaker peered over his glasses. "That's clear." My mother looked confused. "Your Honor," she said sharply, "what does that have to do with anything?" The judge didn't answer immediately. He turned his gaze back to the room and spoke softly, yet firmly. "Ms. Carter served 8 years in the United States. Marine Corps." The words hung in the air. For a moment, the courtroom fell silent. In a small American town like this, filled with retirees and veterans, those words carried weight. You could feel it ripple through the space. A man at the back straightened in his chair. Another older gentleman removed his cap. My father blinked. My mother's mouth dropped open slightly, as if she couldn't believe what she heard. Judge Whitaker's voice remained calm, steady. According to the documentation provided, Ms. Carter served multiple overseas deployments and received several commendations during her service. He set the papers down again. "I don't usually comment on personal matters in a probate case," he continued, "but when someone's character is being publicly questioned, context matters." The courtroom stayed quiet. My parents stared at me like they were looking at a stranger, and in some ways they were. They had never asked, not once, not in 8 years. My father leaned forward slowly. You were in the Marines?" His voice was uncertain, not angry, just confused. I nodded. "Yes." My mother shook her head, disbelief written all over her face. "That can't be right," she whispered. "You never told us that." I kept my voice calm. "You never asked." Those 3 words hit harder than anything else that morning. My mother sank back into her chair. My father rubbed his jaw, quiet and stunned. Attorney Pierce cleared his throat, trying to regain control. Your Honor, he said, while military service is admirable, I fail to see how it affects the matter of the estate. Judge Whitaker nodded. You're correct. Service alone does not determine inheritance. He paused, then added, but it does challenge the narrative that Ms. Carter is— His eyes flicked toward my mother. A useless daughter. My mother's face flushed red. I didn't mean— The judge raised a hand gently. This court is not here to referee family insults, he said, then looked back at the documents. However, it is clear the picture presented earlier was incomplete. Pierce shifted in his seat. My clients were unaware of this information, he said quickly. That's precisely the point, the judge replied, turning his gaze to me. Ms. Carter, why was this not mentioned before? I thought for a moment. The answer was simple. Because I didn't think it mattered, I said. And it didn't. I hadn't come back to Mason County to impress anyone. I came because my grandmother had asked for me in the only way she could, through a will. The judge studied me quietly. Then he nodded once. That's fair. Behind me, someone whispered, Semper Fi. I didn't turn, but I felt a warm surge in my chest. Judge Whitaker straightened the papers. All right, he said. Let's return to the matter at hand. But the room had changed. People no longer saw me as a stranger coming back for money. They looked at my parents, and in their eyes was the same question forming in everyone's mind. How could they not know? My father leaned closer to my mother and whispered something I couldn't hear. She shook her head slowly, still stunned. The truth was, my service didn't change the will. It didn't solve the case. But it exposed something else. A deeper problem. Because when a parent doesn't even know the basic facts of their child's life, questions arise that no legal document can answer. Judge Whitaker glanced at the clock. We will take a short recess, he said. 10 minutes. The gavel tapped once. Murmurs rose immediately. Chairs scraped. Veterans in the room nodded respectfully in my direction as they stood. I stayed, seated. Across the aisle, my parents remained frozen, like the ground beneath them had shifted. The real conversation hadn't even begun. When the judge called the recess, the courtroom loosened like a jar lid twisting open. People stood, stretched, whispered. In a small town, 10 minutes was more than enough for a rumor to circle the room. I stayed at the table, hands folded. Old habits from briefings long ago never left me. A man in his 70s walked slowly past. His faded cap read, Korea Veterans. He paused beside me. Marine? He asked quietly. Yes, sir. He nodded. Semper Fi. Semper Fi, I replied. Then he walked on. No drama, just a quiet understanding between two people who knew something the rest of the room didn't. Across the aisle, my parents remained seated. My father leaned toward my mother, whispering in low tones. She kept shaking her head. A mix of confusion, disbelief, and maybe regret. They had spent years telling a story about me that no longer made sense. Attorney Pierce hovered beside them, whispering hurriedly. His polished confidence had faded. He glanced at me once, then away. His argument was built on who I was supposed to be. Now that picture had cracked. 10 minutes later, the bailiff called everyone back. Judge Whitaker returned to the bench and adjusted the papers. All right, he said. Let's continue. His voice was steady, but the room had shifted. Before, people were curious. Now, they were listening. Mr. Pierce, the judge said, you may proceed. Pierce rose, cautious. Your Honor, while the court has learned new information about Ms. Carter's background, the legal matter remains the same. He gestured toward the will. The question is whether the property transfer was unfairly influenced. Judge Whitaker nodded. And your evidence for that claim? Pierce hesitated. Well, my clients believe— The judge interrupted gently. Belief is not evidence. The room went quiet again. Pierce adjusted his tie, searching for words. In that case, Your Honor, I would like the court to consider the broader context of our family relationships. The judge turned toward me. Ms. Carter, he said, would you like to speak before I review the final documents? I stood slowly, my chair sliding quietly across the floor. For the first time that morning, I glanced at my parents. They looked smaller somehow, not in size but in certainty. My grandmother and I spoke often, I said, keeping my voice calm. Not every week, but whenever we could. My mother scoffed. That's not true. I didn't react. I continued. I sent her letters. Sometimes money when she needed help with groceries or repairs. The judge flipped through the documents again. I see several money orders here, he noted. My father frowned. She never told us about that. I met his eyes briefly. She asked me not to. My mother's voice rose. Why would she do that? I answered honestly. Because she didn't want you to think I was trying to prove something. The judge leaned back slightly. And why did she leave the house to you? He asked. I thought carefully. The answer wasn't legal, it was personal. Because she believed I would take care of it, I said. Pierce folded his arms. Your Honor, with respect, emotional statements don't determine state law. That's correct, Judge Whitaker said. He looked down at the will again, tapping a page lightly. That's why we look at written intent. He paused long enough that everyone in the courtroom leaned forward. Ruth Carter left the property to her granddaughter, Emily Carter. My mother stood abruptly. That's not fair, she said. The bailiff stepped forward, but Judge Whitaker raised a hand. Mrs. Carter, he said calmly, I understand this is difficult. But it's wrong, she insisted. We were there every day. The judge nodded. That may be true, but presence alone does not override a written will. My father stood beside her. So that's it, he said. She just takes it. The judge looked at both of them for a long moment. Then he said something unexpected. This case isn't really about the house, is it? No one answered. It's about years of resentment that finally reached a courtroom, he continued. The room stayed silent. Judge Whitaker looked at me, then back at my parents. Your daughter served this country for 8 years. She returned quietly and did not insult you in this courtroom, he said, folding his hands together. That says something about character. My parents didn't respond. They just stared at the floor. The court will uphold the will as written, the judge said. The gavel tapped once. The property belongs to Miss Carter. That should have felt like victory, but it didn't. Not really. Sometimes revenge isn't loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's just standing still while truth catches up. As the courtroom began to empty, I gathered my papers slowly. Across the aisle, my parents remained seated. For the first time in years, they looked unsure of what to say. And that uncertainty felt heavier than any argument we had. The room's noise didn't disappear all at once. It faded slowly. Chairs scraped the floor. A few murmured polite goodbyes to the judge. I stayed where I was, letting the moment settle. Across the aisle, my mother stared at the floor. My father's hands were tightly folded as if trying to keep them from shaking. Their attorney, Heron Pierce, leaned down and whispered something. I couldn't hear, but the confidence he'd shown earlier was gone. He patted my father on the shoulder awkwardly and left the room. And just like that, it was the three of us. No lawyers, no judge, just a family that hadn't talked for years. I stood, folder in hand. The instinct to leave was strong. That's what I had done before, walking away before words could be said that couldn't be taken back. But something about the quiet kept me there. My father looked up first, his voice rough. You were really in the Marines? I nodded. Yes. He stared, measuring the distance between the daughter he remembered and the one standing before him. 8 years? He asked. Yes. My mother finally lifted her head. You never told us that, she said. But this time her voice was smaller, tired. You never asked, I replied gently. The words weren't meant to hurt, just the truth. My father rubbed the back of his neck, a habit since I was a kid whenever he didn't know what to say. Well, he muttered. I guess we didn't. A few seconds of silence passed. Then my mother asked something I hadn't expected. Were you overseas? I nodded again. Her eyes widened slightly. They realized they hadn't known, not because I hid it, but because we stopped talking long before. My father stood slowly. For a moment, I thought he might get defensive. Instead, he looked around the empty courtroom. "This whole thing was a mistake," he said quietly. My mother turned toward him. "What do you mean?" "Dragging our daughter into court over a house," he said. The word daughter sounded strange coming from him, like he hadn't said it in years. My mother's shoulders sank slightly. I just thought she didn't care about us anymore. I stepped closer. "I did care," I said. "But every time we talked, it turned into an argument." My father nodded slowly. "That's true. You always wanted to do things your way." "Yes," I said. "Did that scare you?" He didn't deny it. For a long, heavy moment, the three of us just stood there in the silent courtroom. The anger that had driven this case suddenly felt smaller, almost insignificant compared to all the years we had lost. Finally, my mother spoke. "So, what will you do with the house?" I thought of the small farmhouse outside town, the creaky porch steps, the apple tree where my grandmother spent countless afternoons. "I'm going to fix it up," I said. My father gave a slow nod. "It needs it," he said. And we all knew that was true. The roof was probably due for replacement. The porch railing was leaning. My grandmother had done her best, but the house had aged with her. He shifted his weight, cleared his throat. "If you want help with the roof," he said, "I still know a thing or two about shingles." I looked at his face carefully. This wasn't control. It was a bridge. A small, shaky bridge between us. "That would be nice," I said. My mother visibly relaxed. Slowly, she stood and picked up her purse. "I suppose we should come by sometime," she said, almost hesitantly. "You're welcome to," I replied. Not a grand invitation, just a simple one, enough to let trust start growing again. We walked out together. The afternoon sun warmed the courthouse steps, and a few townspeople lingered across the street, pretending not to stare. Small towns don't change overnight, but sometimes the way people see you does. My father paused by his car. "Well, guess we'll see you around." I nodded. "Yeah, guess you will." As they drove off, I lingered for a moment. Courthouse behind me, quiet street ahead, and somewhere beyond the town limits, my grandmother's farmhouse, waiting for a new chapter. The case had ended, but something else had just begun. Something slower, harder. Learning how to be a family again. The first Sunday after the court hearing was colder than the week before. October in Ohio has a way of sneaking up on you. One day the trees glow golden, the next the air cuts sharp, reminding you that winter is near. I was on a ladder outside my grandmother's farmhouse when the crunch of tires on gravel reached me. I didn't need to look. My father's old Buick rattled in a way you could hear from half a mile. I climbed down slowly, wiping my hands on a rag. They parked near the barn. For a moment, no one moved. Then the passenger door opened. My mother stepped out first, carrying a covered casserole dish. Some things never change. Sunday lunch in our family always meant someone brought food. My father followed, walking toward the house with that steady stride he'd always had. He looked at the roof and nodded. "You were right," he said. "Those shingles are about 10 years past their prime." I smiled. "That's why I started replacing them." He moved closer, eyeing the ladder, the pile of shingles, the tools laid on the grass. "You can't finish that alone," he said. "I know," I replied. He nodded once. "Good." Then he reached into the back of his car and pulled out a toolbox. No speeches, no grand gestures, just a man opening a toolbox and climbing a ladder. My mother lingered a moment in the yard before stepping onto the porch. "I'll put this in the kitchen," she said softly. The screen door creaked the same as always. Inside, the floors still carried my grandmother's footsteps, the scent of coffee and cinnamon drifting a few minutes later. My father and I worked side by side for most of the morning, replacing shingles, checking boards underneath, hammering nails into old wood that had survived more seasons than any of us. At first, we barely spoke, but working together has a way of unlocking words. 8 years, my father said, handing me another shingle. That's a long time. Yes, I said quietly. He nodded slowly. You must have seen a lot. I thought about the places I'd been. Desert heat, ocean air, long nights on base, when the world felt far from small-town Ohio. I shared a little. He didn't press for more. Some stories take time. Around noon, my mother called from the porch. Lunch is ready. We climbed down the ladder, washed up at the outdoor spigot like old times, and sat at my grandmother's kitchen table, the same table she'd sipped tea at, telling stories about the town from 50 years ago. For a while, we just ate. Then my mother set her fork down. Emily, she said carefully, eyes red, as if holding back thoughts long bottled. I shouldn't have called you useless. The words came slowly, each one pushing past pride to escape. My father nodded beside her. That wasn't right, he added. I let silence settle. You were angry, I said. Yes, my mother admitted. But that doesn't excuse it. My father cleared his throat. We didn't understand. You. Instead of asking, we made assumptions. I nodded. That happens in many families. I was afraid, she said quietly. Afraid of what? That you'd leave. Because I failed you. The room went still. Sometimes the truth hiding under anger is simpler than anger itself. I didn't leave because you failed, I said. I left to figure out who I was. My father leaned back in his chair. That takes courage, he said. From him, that meant more than I expected. After lunch, we sat on the porch. The apple tree in the yard was losing its last leaves. A cool wind whispered through the branches. You know, my father said, gazing at the fields, families used to settle things on porches like this. Before lawyers, my mother added. I smiled faintly. Maybe we're just late. We sat quietly for a long while, not fixing everything, just beginning. Before they left, my father turned toward the house. We'll come by next Sunday, he said. If that's all right, he added. It is, I said, and I meant it. Because reconciliation doesn't always come in one moment. It comes in small steps, shared lunches, repaired roofs, and conversations that finally happen after years of silence. If this story reminds you of someone in your family, a son, a daughter, someone you haven't spoken to in years, remember what my grandmother told me: people aren't always who you think they are. Sometimes they're stronger than you ever realized. If this story meant something, share it with